You may not yet understand the miracle of slow awakening, but you are standing inside it. Empaths do not awaken in a sudden flash of thunder. The soul stretches gradually, like dawn across a sleeping valley. At first, only a thin line of light appears, barely noticeable, fragile, gentle, and for many years, life continues almost unchanged. You live, you give, you absorb the subtleties of others that they themselves cannot name. You carry their unspoken pain like a second skin, and you call it compassion, responsibility, love. Nothing in your tender gift feels like power yet. It feels like burden, like gravity, like a quiet ache moving beneath your ribs. You sense things others ignore. And because sensitivity has no visible shape in this world, you learn to mistrust your own knowing. The psyche, like the moon, reveals only a fraction of itself at any given moment. And you exist for a long time in that twilight, half knowing, half doubting, half remembering some ancient contract you never consciously signed. But there comes a moment, subtle yet inevitable, where the soul trembles like an earthquake beneath the floorboards of your personality. It is slow, barely perceivable, like the soft cracking of ice before a river breaks free. This is where the awakening begins, not as fire, but as a whisper, a dream that lingers when you wake, a heaviness in your chest when you ignore the truth, a sudden inability to tolerate what you once endured quietly. Gracefully, even lovingly, you begin to see the shadows that other people cast, not with anger, but with clarity. You recognize manipulation not because you were harmed, but because you finally understand the architecture of harm. You see the patterns of your childhood replayed in your relationships. And something ancient within you refuses to continue participating. The empath wakes slowly, because the psyche must first rebuild the scaffolding of inner courage, piece by piece, before it can hold the weight of its own truth. The unconscious is not a reservoir of darkness, it is a well of unclaimed light, but light that is buried for too long becomes indistinguishable from shadow. You, empath, grew up in an environment where love may have been conditional, where silence was safer than self-expression, where you believed that connection was earned through self-sacrifice. You learned to feel for two, sometimes for 10, carrying the emotional weight that others had abandoned. This did not make you weak. It made you capable of perceiving the architecture of the soul with astonishing precision. Yet, without awareness, this gift feels like drowning. You absorb too much, you understand too deeply, and understanding without boundaries becomes suffering. Slowly, the awakening unfolds like a lotus rising from the mud. A painful clarity forms around the memory of past wounds, and you begin to ask questions that tremble like fault lines beneath your history. Why did I carry what was never mine? Why did I bleed for those who never learned to hold themselves? Why did I love those who fed on my kindness, yet feared my inner fire? These questions signal the first crack of dawn. The empath begins waking not because the world softens, but because the light inside becomes too bright to ignore. And once this light reaches the threshold of consciousness, it accelerates suddenly. This is the moment where a lifetime of quiet sensing becomes a roar of revelation. Empaths wake slowly, then suddenly, and nothing can put them back to sleep. Not nostalgia, not guilt, not love twisted into duty, not the familiar ache of old roles or old patterns. When the psyche recognizes truth, it cannot return to illusion. In analytical terms, the shadow once integrated cannot be disintegrated. The dragon, once named, will not go back to hiding in the cave of childhood. You may feel fear in this new light, because it exposes everyone and everything, including yourself. But the fear does not come from danger, it comes from growth. Every transformation demands the death of an identity you once clung to. And rebirth always feels like rupture before it feels like liberation. Picture this image, a serpent shedding its skin. From the outside, it appears effortless, but beneath that shedding is immense friction. The snake drags itself across stone, bark, thorn, friction necessary for evolution. The empath too must pass through friction, the friction of truth rubbing against old loyalty, old innocence, old illusions about love. You do not awaken through ease, you awaken through the unbearable recognition that your silence was once a survival strategy, but no longer a destiny. This is the moment where the unconscious rises from the depths and demands to be lived consciously. You begin to speak, you begin to withdraw, you begin to listen to the subtle voice you ignored for decades, your own. And here, something mystical unfolds. You stop confusing empathy with responsibility. You stop believing that you must save others from their shadows. You realize that by carrying their wounds, you prevented them from meeting their inner teacher. This realization can feel cruel, like abandoning a child in a storm. But separation is not abandonment, it is initiation. The caterpillar cannot remain wrapped in familiarity once its wings are formed. The empath cannot remain a container for other people's unconsciousness once their own inner light ignites. A spiritual contract expires, and something in you breaks not from pain, but from awakening when you finally glimpse your own worth. It shocks you, not as grandiosity, but as remembrance. You remember that you are not here to be consumed by the emotional hunger of others. You remember that your intuition is not madness, but compass. You remember that boundaries are not walls, they are sacred architecture protecting a garden where your soul can grow. Awakening is not the acquisition of power, it is the reclamation of it. You are not becoming something new, you are returning to what you were before you were taught to forget. Dreams often speak of this passage long before the ego understands. A dream of walking barefoot through a forest, feeling the earth pulse beneath your feet. A dream of a house where doors appear, where walls used to be. A dream of drowning and then breathing underwater. These are symbols of transformation. The psyche rehearsing liberation before the conscious mind is ready to enact it. Many empaths dream of rooms they avoid entering, rooms that feel heavy but magnetic. These rooms represent the shadow, the unintegrated fragments of self-holding, suppressed rage, unexpressed brilliance, forbidden intuition. You approach them slowly for years. One day, without warning, you walk inside and you do not die. This is the moment where awakening becomes irreversible. You begin to see people not through their words, but through their wounds. Yet for the first time, you do not try to heal them. You observe, you witness, you recognize the archetypes at play: the wounded child, the abandoned lover, the tyrannical father, the seductive victim. You realize that everyone carries mythologies beneath their skin. Your gift is not to become their medicine, but to become their mirror. And mirrors do not fix, they reveal. This is the power that nothing can put back to sleep. You may ask why this awakening takes so long, why the soul delays, why the empath stays soft in a world that sharpens its teeth. It is because the psyche knows the precise timing of its own blooming. A flower that opens in winter dies beneath frost, but one that waits until spring rises effortlessly. Your slow awakening was not weakness, it was incubation. You were gathering silence, gathering insight, gathering emotional x-rays of every soul you encountered. You were learning the anatomy of darkness by living beside it. You were becoming fluent in pain so that you could one day translate it into wisdom. The universe prepares empaths like monks through solitude, through heartbreak, through patterns that repeat until they are understood. Every wound was a classroom. Every betrayal was a text. Every moment you said yes when you meant no was an initiation masked as suffering. And then, one day, you hear the faint sound of truth cracking open. It does not announce itself with thunder, but with a soft trembling inside your bones. You feel the body resist environments that once felt normal. You feel your nervous system reject dishonesty, manipulation, emotional extraction. You become allergic to the version of yourself that survived through self-abandonment. This is the suddenness of awakening, not external explosions, but internal refusal. The empath stops negotiating with their own soul. You no longer shrink to make others comfortable. You no longer bleed to prove you are kind. You no longer confuse being needed with being loved. Something ancient within you steps forward, a deeper self, one who has been waiting like a lion behind a thin veil. In the beginning, this rebirth feels violent. The old self resists. You question your clarity. You fear that boundaries make you cold, unloving, distant. Yet boundaries are not doors closing, they are windows opening. They are the breath you inhale after decades of suffocation. They are not a withdrawal of empathy. They are an evolution of it. You begin loving without losing yourself. You begin helping without collapsing. You begin caring without carrying. The empath grows fangs not to harm, but to protect the sanctity of the heart. Imagine the psyche as a labyrinth. In childhood, you learned to navigate its corridors by intuition alone, feeling the turns rather than seeing them. For years, you believed that confusion was your natural habitat, that chaos was simply how love moved. But awakening hands you a torch. Suddenly you see the architecture clearly, the repeating loops, the rooms with no exit, the path that always led you back to pain disguised as devotion. With the torch of awareness, you no longer wander in circles. You walk with direction. You stop knocking on doors that were never meant for you. You exit the labyrinth you assumed was life itself. Empaths who awaken cannot return to blindness. Once you notice the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Once you realize how you were programmed to self-sacrifice, you cannot willingly return to the altar. The psyche does not regress, it transforms. And transformation often feels like grief. You grieve the version of yourself who did not know better. You grieve the relationships built on your silence. You grieve the years you spent pouring your soul into hands that trembled not from gratitude, but from hunger. Grief is not weakness. Grief is the psyche shedding skin. This shedding often begins with anger, a sacred fire rising from the unconscious. Many empaths fear this fire, believing that anger contradicts compassion. But anger is not the absence of love, it is the boundary of love. Anger says, enough, no more. I'm not here to die in service of your wounds. Anger is the voice of the self reclaiming sovereignty. When the empath allows anger to speak truth instead of dissolving into guilt, awakening accelerates. The fire burns the illusions that kept you small. It clears the forest so new growth can breathe. There is a moment, and you may recognize it, where you look at someone you once adored and feel nothing but clarity, not bitterness, not longing, simply truth. You see through their mask, you see their wounds, you see the child inside them, screaming for validation, unable to love you beyond their capacity. And instead of rescuing them, you release them, not because you stop caring, but because you finally care for yourself. This is the shock of sudden awakening. The empath unhooks, the bond dissolves, the chain breaks. You return your power to your own hands, like a sword you forgot you forged. This is the moment people call you changed. They say you are colder, harder, distant. They do not understand that fire is warmer than bleeding, that clarity is kinder than compliance. They mistake your sovereignty for cruelty because they benefited from your softness. They long for the sleeping version of you, the one who absorbed their storms without asking for shelter in return. But you are not here to be weathered, you are here to be the weather. Once awakened, the empath becomes paradox, soft but immovable, loving but untouchable, present but no longer absorbent. You feel more, not less, but you no longer mistake other people's emotions for your own. You no longer swallow darkness to keep the peace. Peace born from self-betrayal is not peace, it is paralysis. The awakened empath does not avoid conflict. They stop participating in it unconsciously. Silence becomes strength, not submission. Distance becomes wisdom, not abandonment. You stand like a tree with deep roots. Storms may bend you, but they can no longer uproot you. Do you see now? The slow awakening was preparation. The sudden awakening is ignition. Once lit, the flame cannot be unlit. Not by love, not by guilt, not by loneliness, not by the familiar pull of old patterns. You might temporarily doubt. You might briefly soften into nostalgia. But you cannot forget the taste of truth once it enters your bloodstream. The soul, once awake, refuses sedation. Dreams change here too. Instead of drowning, you dream of flying. Instead of being chased, you turn to face the pursuer, and it dissolves into smoke. Instead of endless hallways, you dream of wide windows and open fields. The psyche speaks in symbols, and symbols change when you do. A common dream among awakening empaths is the breaking of mirrors. You look into a mirror and see not your face, but your shadow smiling back. Then the glass fractures and falls like rain. This dream is liberation. The old self-image shatters. A new one emerges whole, sovereign, unfragmented. People will say you've changed, but the truth is you have returned. Return. That is the secret most people miss when they speak of awakening. It is not transformation into something new, but remembrance of what you always were before the world taught you to shrink. The empath's awakening is not invention, it is excavation. You dig through layers of childhood conditioning, through inherited silence, through ancestral wounds, until you find the original self, the one who knew truth before they knew fear. This self is not fragile. This self is not confused. This self does not overgive to earn love. This self is a flame in the center of the psyche. And when you reach it, you realize it was burning all along. You only lost sight of it because you were trained to see others more clearly than yourself. Empaths wake slowly because they must first learn to see through illusion, not only the illusion others project, but the illusion they build around their own identity. You believed you were the healer, the caretaker, the quiet one who carries storms without complaint. But this was never your nature, it was your armor. Sensitivity does not exist to make you small. It exists to make you conscious. The awakened empath stops confusing softness with submission. You remain gentle, but you are no longer permeable. You still feel deeply, but you refuse to drown in what is not yours. And when this inner shift occurs, it radiates outward. Relationships change. Some collapse quickly, like dying stars. Others fade, not from anger, but from incompatibility with your new vibration. Some strengthen, because those who loved you truly are relieved to meet the version of you who no longer hides. People who depended on your emotional labor will panic. Those who fed on your self-sacrifice will rage. They will insist that you are selfish, ungrateful, cold, but you have simply returned to equilibrium. You can love without losing yourself now. And this threatens anyone who relied on your disempowerment. This is why nothing can put you back to sleep, because now you see Once you see how many of your relationships survived only because you dimmed your light, you cannot dim it again without feeling your soul suffocate. Once you see the difference between love and dependency, you cannot pretend they are the same. Once you feel the weightless clarity of being true to yourself, the heaviness of self-abandonment becomes unbearable. You may occasionally stumble. You may momentarily revert to familiar patterns, but these regressions feel like wearing clothing, 2 sizes too small, constricting, artificial, impossible to breathe in. Slow awakening gives you awareness. Sudden awakening gives you freedom. And freedom comes with responsibility not to others, but to your inner truth. Freedom demands that you stop betraying yourself for connection. Freedom asks you to risk loneliness rather than shrink yourself to be chosen. Freedom calls you to walk away from those who only loved you when you were quiet enough to serve their needs. Freedom requires that you listen to the subtle tremors of intuition, the tightening in the throat, the heaviness in the chest, the pulse of knowing that rises like a tide under your ribs. Intuition is not a voice, it is a field of sensation. The empath lives inside this field. Awakening teaches you to trust it. Picture this moment like a threshold. You are standing in the doorway between your past and your becoming. Behind you lie years of self-erasure, the smiles you forced, the forgiveness you granted too quickly, the boundaries you softened to avoid being misunderstood. In front of you lies the unknown, vast, luminous, terrifying in its openness. The psyche trembles here because freedom is both exhilarating and destabilizing. When you are no longer guided by external approval, you must learn to navigate by inner compass. The old map is useless. The path must be felt, not seen. Most people fear this kind of freedom, so they choose familiarity over expansion. But the empath, once awakened, cannot go back. Your nervous system remembers the taste of liberation. Your dreams show you wings where wounds used to be. You walk differently, not to prove your worth, but because you finally feel it. Worth becomes gravity in your bones. You stop chasing love because you have rerouted into yourself. The world senses this shift. Some step closer, some step away. Both movements are blessings. There's a strange silence that accompanies this stage of awakening, not outer silence, but inner. The mind stops spiraling, the heart stops begging, the soul stops whispering, because it no longer needs to be subtle. You have learned to listen. You are no longer at war with your own sensitivity. The very trait that once overwhelmed you becomes instrument. You read intention like weather. You sense truth beneath language. You perceive trauma histories without needing them explained. But now, and this is the difference, you do not lose yourself in that knowing. Awakening does not take away your empathy, it recalibrates it. Before awakening, you feel everything. After awakening, you feel clearly. The difference is consciousness. The difference is self. The difference is boundaries that move like rivers rather than walls. You flow, but you do not flood. You care, but you do not collapse. You witness suffering, but you do not inherit it. You offer compassion, but not your lifeblood. At this stage, something extraordinary happens. You begin to dream your future instead of reliving your past. You start envisioning experiences that align with expansion rather than survival. You no longer replay old wounds, you alchemize them. You begin seeing in symbols wolves representing sovereignty, fire representing transformation, oceans representing emotional depth that no longer terrifies you. Your psyche stops communicating in warnings and begins communicating in invitations. This is where creativity awakens, where purpose awakens, where the self you suppressed begins speaking like thunder inside your chest. You feel drawn to pursuits that once intimidated you. You express truths you once swallowed. You step into rooms you once watched from the doorway. You belong to yourself now. And belonging to yourself is the foundation of belonging anywhere. You realize you were never fragile, you were unclaimed. And now you claim yourself. The final stage of awakening is integration, not the moment of seeing, but the lifelong practice of living what you have seen. Many imagine awakening as a peak, a single revelation that resolves everything. But true transformation is not an event, it is embodiment. You do not wake up once you wake up again each time you refuse to abandon yourself. You wake up each time you choose truth over comfort. You wake up each time you break a pattern instead of repeating it. Awakening is the soul's decision, repeated daily, to live from its center rather than from its wounds. This is where shadow work begins to deepen, not as excavation of pain, but as dialogue with it. The shadow is not darkness, it is exiled light. It contains the power you suppressed to remain loved. It holds the words you swallowed, the boundaries you never spoke, the anger you were taught to fear. When you turn toward it, it no longer chases you through dreams, it becomes your ally. You begin to feel the pulse of instinct, sharp, swift, precise, not impulsive, but deeply intuitive. You move through the world with the calm confidence of someone who knows that no external authority outweighs the authority of the self. And here lies the quiet irony. The more you awaken, the less you need to prove that you have. You stop explaining yourself. You stop defending your vision. You stop seeking validation from those who fear their own evolution. The awakened empath does not persuade, they simply inhabit truth. And others feel it like weather shifting across the room. Presence becomes language. Silence becomes expression. You influence not by force, but by frequency. It is in this stage that destiny begins to assemble itself around you. Paths open without effort. You meet people who resonate rather than drain. You feel drawn to creation rather than rescue. Your life no longer revolves around emotional survival, it expands toward meaning, purpose, and alignment. You begin building instead of bleeding. You begin choosing instead of reacting. You begin leading instead of following invisible emotional tides. There is nothing arrogant about this. It is the natural architecture of a soul no longer shrinking to fit inside old constraints. Still, you will have moments where the past calls you back through memory. through habit, through the soft echo of loneliness. Nostalgia is the final test of awakening, not the nostalgia for good memories, but the nostalgia for familiarity. Even when familiarity once hurt you, the psyche craves what it knows. Even if what it knows is small, in these moments you may feel a tug toward old roles: caretaker, peacekeeper, emotional sponge. You may feel tempted to dull your awareness just enough to fit back into old systems. But the awakened self cannot be fooled. You can revisit old rooms, but you cannot live in them again. The body rejects what the soul has outgrown. And so you keep walking forward into a life where love is mutual, not extracted, forward into a life where your intuition is compass, not curse, forward into a life where power and compassion coexist without contradiction, forward into a life where you belong to yourself first, not out of selfishness, but out of wholeness. Empaths wake slowly, then suddenly, and nothing can put them back to sleep. Because once you know your worth, you cannot unknow it. Once you feel your power, you cannot unfeel it. Once you taste freedom, dependency becomes poison. Once you stand in your truth, silence becomes throne. You walk now with an awareness that does not tremble. You are not blinded by illusion, nor seduced by chaos, nor manipulated by emotional hunger disguised as love. You sense what is true beneath what is spoken. You feel the intention behind the action. You read subtext like scripture. You honor your nervous system as oracle. You know when someone approaches with open heart or open wound. You know when presence nourishes you and when it empties you. This is not cynicism, it is clarity. Clarity is the empath's final gift. The slow awakening taught you to sense. The sudden awakening taught you to see. The final awakening teaches you to choose. Choose peace over validation. Choose solitude over self-erasure. Choose truth over belonging. Choose becoming over remembering. Choose self-respect over love that costs your soul. You are no longer asleep inside your own life. You are no longer dreaming someone else's dream. You are no longer living someone else's story. You stand now at the threshold of your own becoming, and beyond this threshold lies the life meant for you before you were taught to betray your own essence. A life where feeling is not weakness, but instrument. A life where intuition is not burden, but compass. A life where empathy does not drain, but radiates. A life where your presence heals, not because you absorb, but because you align. Awakening does not make you holy, it makes you whole. And wholeness is the most powerful state a human soul can occupy. So walk forward, not softly, but consciously, not as the wounded healer, but as the sovereign empath, not as the one who saves others, but as the one who finally saves themselves. Empaths wake up slowly, yes, gently, quietly, like dawn, but then one morning they rise with a force the world did not anticipate. And once they rise, they do not fall back into dreaming. The world cannot put them back to sleep, because the soul cannot unknow the sun.